the end of your talk, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it anyway and get various different perspectives. I'll start at Dan and come forward. Just to ask, does government help or hinder innovation? And in answering that, if you can also consider the various things we might have had if people's money and creative efforts had gone in different directions to the direction government sometimes pushed them in. So are there situations in which government can be an asset for innovation, or is it always a net negative?
I think on the balance of things, hi by the way, Daniel Pryor from the Adam Smith Institute. I think on balance, yeah, it's almost always a negative. I think that the most promising angles for government to have a positive impact are in organisations like DARPA or ARIA that take an approach to innovation that tries to move away as much as possible from that top-down approach or that kind of goal-driven approach, and just generally give people with promising ideas the resources to pursue them. I think that's the kind of best way that we can use government if we are going to use it at all. In terms of hindering though, for me, I wanted to kind of highlight one really key area that I've been looking at recently in specifically the UK, but also I think around the world, that the government really hinders innovation. And weirdly, that's housing policy. The connection isn't always as obvious as might become apparent. Some of you may have read a really interesting post called The Housing Theory of Everything that was published a couple of years ago. But the reason I say that is because a really important factor in determining the amount of innovation that takes place is geographical proximity. Being able to concentrate areas with a high number of creative, innovative, driven people, and then being able to bounce their ideas off each other, exchange ideas between different industries, different interests. And the problem is, especially in the UK, but also I think in various other countries, that government gets in the way in really obvious ways that prevents housing from being built in areas that people want to live. And that really has a lot of follow-on effects on the amount of innovation being generated. You think about the London Stock Exchange or Lloyd's of London. These were started in coffee shops hundreds of years ago, places where people from all walks of life meet, exchange ideas, learn about each other's different fields. And getting in the way, I think, through restrictive housing policy and planning policy is a really important way that the government kind of holds back innovation. One that I think isn't always acknowledged, just the sheer kind of impact that it has compared to other factors in this discussion.
Sorry, I neglected to introduce everyone, so I should have done that. Dan is Head of Research at the Adam Smith Institute. Johan, you've met already. Jon is lead editor, I think, is your correct title at the Objective Standard. Managing editor at the Objective Standard. And Rebecca is a particle physicist at CERN.
Not a particle physicist.
I'm sorry, you're not a particle physicist.
No, accelerator physicist.
Accelerator physicist. Works with particles.
Well, we will do.
Johan, you kind of addressed this already in your talk, but did you want to add anything on this question?
Not really. I could add at least one area where governments potentially can speed up progress in a way, or innovation, in a way that, at least an argument that I haven't disproven in my talk. And that's by creating incentives, by basically saying, look, if you can calculate the longitude historically, or if you come up with a way of beaming electricity across vast places, you'll get £1 billion. That's a way which is less harmful than many of the other ideas of how we should sort of top-down control and pick technological winners. And it can speed up progress in a way where everybody is a little bit mobilized, realizing that, oh, there's a financial incentive here, but then still use their local information, knowledge, and tools to try to come up with various ways of moving into that direction. Then obviously the question is, would the government pick the right incentives better than people would do voluntarily? I'm not sure about that, but at least it's much less harmful than trying to pick a certain technology.
Or would they pick the right goals?
Yeah, exactly.
Would they incentivize the right
that's
things?
what I mean. Yeah.
I assume I'm next.
Yeah, I was just going to say that it's noteworthy that private industry does that already as well with things like the X Prize. You know,
Yeah.
The first private space flight was funded by the X Prize and cancer treatments, that kind of thing. Wealthy people do exactly that as well.
Yeah. So I think that the government has a role in innovating in a couple very small and specific areas. Namely, well, really just one, it's the protection of individual rights. And how do you do that? Well, you need military technology. And I don't think that the government can necessarily innovate and create all that technology on its own, but perhaps it has some small role in overseeing that and saying, this is what we need. We're going to find the innovators that are out there in the world right now. They're working on this sort of thing. We're going to work with those people on addressing these needs. And so military technology, but also just generally, what do, for instance, police need in their vehicles? What sorts of body armor do they need? What can they take from a furry fandom conference to keep themselves cool in their gear? So I think that that's the primary place where governments have a role in innovation, is to ensure that they have the technology that they need to do what I think is their one job, which is to ensure that our rights are not violated. And I do think that when the government steps in and says we're going to choose X or Y to incentivize, that they are in a sense really impeding this figuring out process, because as Johan said, it's very uncertain where innovations are going to come from. And one thing I'll talk about more in my talk is how funding is currently happening, how this sort of does impede innovation a little bit. So I don't want to preempt that too much, but I'll just say that when they hold, well, governments don't create money, so the money that they're taking from taxpayers is not going to what those people on their own would actually decide to fund. And I think that does impede innovation.
Rebecca, you've had first-hand experience of government funding of science. So how do you think that's impacted it for you?
So when we say government helping, in what form are they helping? Very often there's a call for a very particular pot of money that they're willing to give to people if you apply. And the list on this application is going to be very strict, and it's going to be their idea of helping. Which means that if I have something I want to work on and I want to apply to this part of funding, I'm going to have to reshape my idea and my innovation to try and fit these incredibly stringent government requirements that are completely arbitrary. That's why, as Daniel says before, things like ARIA is, I think, a lot more flexible and a lot more incredible as a way for government to help. So I made an ARIA application earlier this month, and I think that's going to be the way to go if we want to have government helping.
Yeah. So the question is, do we want to have government helping? But I'll move on to another question for now, which is, if you go back to the 1950s and look at predictions of what the world we live in today was supposed to look like, it's very different to the one we actually do. And there's a lot of things, even though we have the benefit of computer technology that's changed the world enormously, there's a lot of things that didn't happen that were supposed to happen. Space travel's one, flying cars, the sort of Jetsons lifestyle that we were promised in the 50s failed to materialize. Why do you think that is? What do you think held back innovation from going the direction where the futurists of the past thought it would go?
So I guess to start, it kind of comes back to the point you made at the end of your talk, Johan, referencing Virginia Postel's book. And it was on this idea of progressives and conservatives sharing the claim towards, this is the ideal society we want to work towards, this is what it's going to look like. And you contrast that with, I think, the kind of market-based approach of not knowing where things are going to go. So the kind of simple answer to that question, why aren't things the way that X person predicted them 50 years ago, is because markets are unpredictable, and that's a good thing. On flying cars specifically, we're getting very close. We have electronic vertical takeoff and landing development, so we will have some flying cars well, we already do. They're just not commercially licensed yet, as far as I'm aware. But yeah, just the kind of general point that just because now doesn't look like how people 50 years predicted it would look, doesn't mean that there's been necessarily a slowdown or a great stagnation in the progress of innovation and ideas. I think also, to kind of give an example, you mentioned computing power, the kind of development of graphics card, of semiconductor technology, etc. I think that's an area where it's very difficult to predict that would happen. The consequences aren't as kind of grand or visionary or futurist vibey as flying cars, but nonetheless, those sort of things do make a massive difference. It's just in ways that aren't as easily seen to the kind of observer looking at it.
Johan?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, that innovation is unpredictable and it happens in strange places. And personally, I think it's more important the fact that I have digital maps in my pocket than a flying car. It's better at getting me where I want to go than a flying car would. Not that I'm opposed to flying cars, but sometimes demand is in other areas. But there is also something about our aversion to risks in society, and perhaps that's based on aging societies. When we get richer and have longer life expectancies, perhaps it's inescapable that we get a little less excited by strange new things that can go wrong. And then there is a political ideology from both left, right, and Greens about not really taking risks. We've had this massive explosion of innovation in digital technology and computers, because that's ones and zeros on a screen, and we're free to experiment in crazy ways, and then we'll see wonderful things happening. But with physical atoms rather than bits, anything you do is under incredibly heavy scrutiny from governments. Not just that there's often laws that are based on particular technologies, but also any kind of risk assessment is incredibly difficult to get around. And in that case, it's safe to work in other areas than with flying cars. And that's bad, I think. I mean, it's not an unpredictable experiment if there isn't a risk that you blow your fingers off. We need sort of crazy stuff happening in garages that will blow up once in a while. Because if it doesn't, we haven't taken enough risks as a society, I think. But that's a difficult message to get across every time something blows up. Because the people always say, oh, look, that wasn't supposed to have happened, so we need stronger regulations over there. And that's a dangerous temptation.
Why we need to lose more fingers.
Yeah. That's a great book title, actually.
I don't have a great amount to add to that, but I do think that perhaps the regulatory environment has a lot to do with it. If you look at that time frame and the innovations that people forecast will be coming, but also just the growth of the regulatory state, and I'll mention again, like how research is now done. I think that those things definitely play a role in stifling this sort of progress. But again, I'll just underline the point that both Daniel and Johan made. Although we have a particular vision of how we think the future might be, and that vision is hugely important, I think we absolutely need visionaries and science fiction writers and screenwriters to give us these brilliant ideas for us to go try. Innovation is really unpredictable, and perhaps the best use of our time right now is not the flying car. Maybe it would be better for us to have autonomous vehicles and maps to get us from point A to point B. So although I really want a flying car and get on the waiting list as soon as they're available, there are several, I think, combining factors that keep us from having them at this point.
Yeah. Can I just add to that? I think that's a really important point about science fiction writers and how a cultural sense of life in the 50s, or at least before the Second World War, was incredibly hopeful in pointing out a possible wonderful future. Whereas afterwards we've seen so much more, not just books, but film series where technology is dangerous and the crooks are scientists, often in lab coats, destroying the planet. Rich people are scientists. Basically, entrepreneurs and scientists are the villains. And in that case, perhaps we won't get this incredible push for people with talent to go moving into those exciting areas. So I think we need a counter trend to that. It's post-apocalyptic, everything that's in series now.
One thing that you both alluded to that I forgot to mention is the environmentalist movement. I think has had a huge impact on this sort of technology. I mean, emissions and why do we want more potential for destroying ourselves? So.
Yeah.
Sure.
And you phrase it like that.
Another book title.
I'd also like to add that just because something is very easy to dream up doesn't correlate with it being easy to do.
Good point.
It doesn't matter how much you love the idea of flying cars, that doesn't correlate to the fact that gravity exists and that cars are heavy. So when you're thinking
What
about
a downer.
yeah, it pulls down. So dream, for sure. But when you dream, you're like, okay, how are we going to get here? We have two steps. We have the predictable incremental steps. And that's what you do when you throw money at it. You'll go, okay, first we'll make a lighter material, and then we'll make a more powerful battery energy source. And then there's the disruptive routes. And that relates to everything we've said so far about innovation, is that the disruptive technologies that are coming along are going to be worse initially because they're going to be blowing up in garages. But then when they exceed, they're going to increase exponentially. And that's the thing that we need to be keeping an eye out for is, okay, whose garages are looking particularly explosive right now? That's where the flying cars may come from.
I love the exploding garages direction this has gone in. I also love the science fiction point. I actually might, Liberty International over there running a conference in August, and I might speak at their conference about Star Trek and the effect that's had on innovation, because we wouldn't have cell phones if it wasn't for Star Trek. It was the Motorola innovator who made the first cell phone was inspired by the Star Trek communicator. Tablet computers were inspired by Star Trek. So having that kind of optimistic fiction, as opposed to the negative dystopian Blade Runner style, more dominant in our culture, is really important to getting people into science.
Like Hitchhiker's Guide just predicted the Kindle outright.
Yeah.
It's the same thing.
Yeah.
Plus audiobook.
And the universal translator, even though
Yes.
that was a fish, so it wasn't really an innovation, right? But we do have it now.
The bagel fish, yeah. So hopefully to lift the tone a bit, I wanted to ask how optimistic each of you is about the next 100 years. Innovation, not just technological, but also social innovation. How optimistic are you that we will live in a better world 100 years from now, or 50 years from now?
As an AI optimist and a rampant utilitarian, I look forward to the next 100 years involving us being plugged into lovely matrix simulations and everything will be fine. No, I think 100 years off is it's almost, it's worth kind of pontificating over from like a futurist cultural standpoint, but I think that time frame is almost too long to make any firm predictions about pretty much anything, especially with the kind of the recent trends. AI is the classic one, where you got the potential for exponential progress, right? So even trying to envision that, I think, is difficult. There are very smart people attempting to do so, but even there, the time frame of relevance is more kind of 40 to 50 years. But in general, with all things, I'm an optimist. And the reason for that is that, even in fairly closed societies throughout history, we've still seen innovation. No matter how much the government tries to clamp down on creative thinking, on people trying new ideas, individuals find a way. And even if we see this kind of the trend of the growth in the regulatory state continuing to expand and get worse and so on, I don't think that means that we'll be stuck in a kind of static vision or static nightmare of what society will be. And I think the most interesting thing is pointing to specific technologies where there's near-term progress, right? So lab-grown meat, classic example, lots of environmentalists against it, which I find hilarious. There's been some papers written about how rather than saving cattle-based emissions, it'll actually end up being more, kind of taking the technology as it is now as opposed to where it's like to be in 10, 20 years or so. That for me is huge from a kind of animal suffering perspective as well. There's a potentially enormous gain to well-being, welfare, through this technology being widely adopted and through people being less concerned with, it was grown in a lab, therefore it's not a real steak. The kind of gradual social adaptation. In energy generation, I think that there's really exciting prospects there when it comes to small modular reactors, which I touched on previously, the potential for much cheaper and much quicker building of nuclear power, which I think is the key kind of issue for the UK certainly. So yeah, 100 years I'm not sure of, but the next 10, 20 years, very optimistic.
Yeah, I'm a card-carrying optimist, so I'm incredibly hopeful about the next 10 and 100 years and 1,000 years, even more so. And if I had to mention one particular area, it's AI, because there we have another Star Trek innovation. You know, the universal computer that you're talking to on the Enterprise, now we all got one that has accumulated all the knowledge that exists in the world and talks to me about it. It gives me answers and helps me to do whatever I want. It's a mind-blowing potential when we get that into any kind of technology and into our lives, biotechnology and so on. But I'd mentioned that the real reason why I'm an optimist is not really the technologies as such, but the institutions. I talked about how we need open society. So, I mean, it's a choice. We can wreck it as well if we stumble and fall. But the risk of doing that, I think, is smaller than it's been before, for the simple fact that the world is more decentralized than before. We have more political entities, more different places, with more people alive than ever before, who get a longer education and are almost all connected to the accumulated knowledge of everybody else. So even if we were to fail, even if Britain and Sweden and the United States stumbled and fell and banned all future innovation, somebody out there is going to keep on carrying the torch, I think. And that wasn't the case in the 40s or 100 years ago. Then it was only a few places could fail and we wouldn't see much more progress. So, I mean, garages will blow up somewhere in the world at least. And in that case, even if we make stupid mistakes here, and we will be able to use that knowledge and those innovations as well, I think. And that makes the world a little bit safer for progress than it's been in the past.
I'll quickly add to that it's really valuable to have other parts of the world to carry the flame of civilization when one area isn't. Like when Europe was in its dark age and really the church and the kings were preventing any kind of innovation, it was actually the Islamic kingdom that was maintaining it and maintaining Aristotelian philosophy and Greek knowledge. And then it was China that kept things moving in the 10th, 11th centuries, and then it was Europe when those parts of the world weren't so flourishing anymore. So that diversity of places is really important.
Well, Thomas, you bring up a really good point, because in these cultures in the past, there has often been, except for the Dark Ages, some culture to carry the torch of reason. And this is the one place where I'm perhaps a little bit more fearful than my fellow panelists, because the garage that I think is most dangerous if it blows up is actually the political garage. And I think that it could blow up if there are enough people that are poorly educated that think that the government has this massive role to play in our lives and demands it. And unfortunately, for the past 100 or so years, we've had education that instills this very idea, at least in the US. And I think that these countries that are leading in progress are also leading as the intellectual leaders of the world. And if we uphold that message for the world, and if everyone on earth believes that government has this role to play, then I fear that there isn't really a safe haven for progress. So on the one hand, I do see massive technological improvements, but I also see people rallying against them. So I think that if there is to be a future for progress, we have to be realistic about it. And the thing that it requires is for us, for everybody here who understands the value of human progress and human flourishing, to point out the connections between these things and to do it incessantly and as persuasively as it possibly can be done. Otherwise, perhaps there won't be such a great future for progress.
For the last few decades, we've experienced all the development probably in the silicon technology in our semiconductors. I am extremely excited for what comes after that in photonics optics, which is no longer going to be as limited as silicon-based materials. But even beyond that, I'm very excited about the future biological revolution. Because when we look at ourselves sat here, We're more energy efficient and computationally competent than any laptop or computer or AI. And once we can work out why biology is so efficient using food for its energy rather than, a battery, electricity, then we're going to be seeing a world that none of us can recognize. And I'm excited for this, and I'm terrified of this, because once we are able to manipulate biology, that means we can manipulate ourselves, and then we get into the sci-fi and the scary.
The furry fandom conventions will be different.
Genetically engineered cat girls.
To designer babies as well there, aren't we? I'm going to add a little extra question inspired by what a couple of the other panelists said. Historically, in the last couple of hundred years, it's really been the United States that's driven innovation more than any other country, and Britain's in second place mostly. That's changing a lot now. America's getting a lot less free than it used to be. And we also, in Europe, we have an EU that bans everything until it decides it's going to permit it. Where in the world do you think is going to be the place that encourages innovation in the future? Is it in Europe? Is it in America? Is it in Asia? Somewhere else?
Switzerland. Right now. I mean, have you seen how many startups they have? It's ridiculous.
I have heard Switzerland often suggested as one of the freest countries in the world.
It's specifically German-speaking part of Switzerland, Zurich. So many startups and over there.
Any competing offers?
I'm trying to remember the brand name of it, but recently I was recommended a antiviral that was developed in Israel initially for COVID, but also gets rid of flus off label. So in general, I think there's an awful lot of innovation in various fields taking place in Israel. That's especially relevant to sort of my lines of work. Medical cannabis, for example, Israel's a centre of development in that, but also healthcare more broadly. That's my answer.
Let me just say that I was so hopeful a few minutes ago. Let me just say that there's a very problematic direction, especially in the European Union, when it comes to innovation, whereby they have this idea that they are going to second guess this ecosystem of trial and error in many areas. And the most stupid recent example is the harmonization of cell phone chargers. Because they think that now we have the perfect one, let's make sure that everybody's got one. And I'm happy they were delayed by 15 years in doing this, because otherwise we all have the chargers of 15 years ago, much bigger, heavier, slower to charge, and so on. And this is incredibly dangerous temptation, because anytime you make anything standardized and obligatory for everybody, you block all future progress. Then in the end, what really happens, and this is actually what they say when I ask them, so what if someone comes up with a better charger? Okay, then they'll come to us and we'll look at it and decide if it's better, and then we'll use that as a standard in the future. And I mean, this is a reversion to that old story, possibly semi-apocryphal, about the Roman Empire, where you have the innovator who invented unbreakable glass, and he goes to the emperor, Tiberius, because that's what you do. If you don't have an ecosystem of markets and of venture capital, you can't start the process and incrementally improve it. Instead, you go to the emperor and ask him, is this good? Will you give me lots of money for it? And obviously in the story, Tiberius says, does anybody else know about this unbreakable glass? No. Okay, execute him. And they chop his head off because he was afraid that this material would become more important than gold. So that would challenge Tiberius' standing and obviously hurt the glass industry. And people will lose job with this creative destruction. This is a reversion to Tiberius' version of innovation. And if we see that in more areas, trying to second guess what social media should look like, how chargers are going to be like, electricity production and so on, that blocks all future progress. So let's hope that other areas are free enough to experiment so that they can at least import a better standard once in a while, because it won't happen here.
On the topic of what area, what geographic area, what country will sort of lead in progress, I think that one of the beautiful things about how the world is developed is just how open it has become. And the unforeseen combinations of ideas. And this is by and large driven by the fact that people from all of these different places with all of these different ideas can communicate and combine these ideas. These ideas can have sex and give life to new things that no one had foreseen. And so I have a hard time sort of pinpointing one place where I think it will be the center of innovation. I think that to the extent we get it, it's going to be just a greater and greater networking and perhaps coming up with new and innovative ways for people to join their ideas together, and for somebody in South Korea to be working on perhaps like biological experiments in tandem with somebody in Southern California. So I'm hopeful that it'll take that sort of direction as opposed to just being one geographic area that is a safe haven for innovation.
Yeah, we do get more and more research papers with more than 1,000 authors. That's pretty impressive. So we are connecting people.
But did 999 of those 1,000 authors do anything to contribute to the paper?
Bursting the bubble.
Yeah, exactly.
Just the collectivist mentality.
Cool. Yeah, I don't think California is going to be on the top of the list for innovation in the coming years, but yeah, that internationality and the way the internet's broken down borders. Borders are a sort of a fiction created by government to some extent. They should exist to fill security, but the way they break down communication and interaction between people, the number of people who wanted to be here today and couldn't because if you're from Georgia, you need a visa to come and visit England. That is such a break on creativity. And on a sort of related point on the international angle, but also on a personal level, one of the main objections you get to innovations, like I'm going to talk later about private space flight, and like Johan described with the bicycle, is that they increase inequality, and automation is another one that this gets thrown around a lot. You're going to have all these truck drivers and warehouse operatives out of work, and the poor will get poorer and the rich will get richer. There's this idea that innovation will increase inequality. A, I don't think that's necessarily true, and B, I'm not convinced it's a bad thing necessarily, but I'd really like to get you guys' angle on that question on, does innovation increase inequality both between wealth brackets and between countries, like between the West and Africa and things like that? And B, is that necessarily a bad thing if it is true?
I think that the short answer is yes initially and then no over time. As with pretty much any innovation, initially the costs are going to be extremely high. It's only going to be adopted by a small number of wealthy people. Gradually, as it's more commercialized, as it's improved upon, the cost comes down and it becomes more of a mass market product or technology or service and whatnot. And people always look at the former and say this will increase inequality, but they just don't have that long-term mindset, right? Like Johan talking about the recipe computer costing what, $70,000, an insane amount, and you can get much more powerful, much more cheap computers now for a fraction of that cost. So that's the first answer. The second is I don't care. To be perfectly frank, when it comes to whether even if it did increase inequality in the long run, it's the classic. We're in the UK, so to use the Thatcher example, the poor get poorer, the rich get richer, etc. It's one of those things where as long as the absolute value or the absolute income of people, the absolute purchasing power, whatever metric you want to use goes up, then it doesn't matter if the people on the top goes up by more. That's just not a concern for me. It is a concern for many people, and as I said, I think wrongly it's just not borne out by historical experience, but even if it was, that shouldn't be a good reason for kind of holding us back. On the global angle, I think the same story is very much true, where it might be that scientists in a particular nation develop a particular technology and try to jealously guard it. Eventually those benefits will diffuse into countries around the world and alleviate, I think, probably the more important inequality, if there is one, which is between countries and between rich nations and poorer nations.
I think that we live in a more equal world than we ever had before at any stage in human history. Not when you look at pounds and pennies, and because the rich have many more zeros after the first number in their bank accounts. But if you look at everything that makes life good, it's more equally distributed than it's ever been before. And there, if you take this wonderful thought experiment of your grandpa's grandma suddenly found a time machine, and she suddenly appears now from 200 years ago in the home of one of the super rich, say Bill Gates' home. What would astonish her most? I don't think it would be the size of his bank account. She would be shocked by the fact that he's got drinking water out of the tap and it doesn't kill him. And it's hot water as well. And he can make the whole room warmer or colder if he chooses to. He's got plenty of comfortable clothes and he can make them clean again by just putting them into a box and waiting a while. And with a smaller metallic box, he can sort of communicate with people on the other side of the planet in real time. And he can hold it against any object or person, and it takes a perfect picture of it that he can keep and send to the other side of the world. And he's got plenty of exotic food. He's not starving. And he's like, what is he, 70? And he's alive, which is amazing as well. He can jump into a bigger metal box and just travel faster than a horse can ride. And if he moves into a bigger cylindrical metal thing, he can fly to other continents. It's like, it's shocking. He's not just super duper rich. He's a magician. He's got all these amazing things. But the most amazing thing, of course, is that so do we. That's what's the biggest difference between us and our grandmothers, and not between us and Bill Gates. And why is that the case? Well, because Bill Gates and Sam Walton and Jeff Bezos have been allowed to become super duper wealthy by reducing the price of all those goods and services that improves our lives. So inequality in that regard has reduced inequality everywhere where it matters.
Absolutely. We have a quality of metal boxes, which is way more important than a quality of zeros, because innovation is so expensive. It costs so much money. Look at some of the space exploration that's going on right now. If somebody had said, well, we don't want anybody to make more than X amount of dollars, then it would just be that none of us would ever reap the benefits that we will reap, because of these people who are so wealthy or putting their money into crazy things like bicycles and washing machines and recipe machines. We need those, we need the inequality. I don't have the data to say yes or no, does innovation increase inequality, but I think in terms of monetary inequality, it is a good thing if it does, because it means that some of those people will take some of that money and put it into innovations that we can all benefit from.
I think at the moment of course there are financial inequalities, but there's also a huge thing of educational inequalities. At the moment, a lot of our innovation is in the digital sphere, and now I think most people in the world, I would say, have a phone. Of course, not everyone can afford one, but that's like a standard now. And so when we have these innovations, going back to ChatGPT, you can pay for ChatGPT if you want to go past that paywall, but we all have access to it. The thing is now is who knows how to use it as best as possible. And that comes from the education part of, okay, what am I looking at with this new innovation? Do I know how to use it to its fullest? Do I understand when it's giving me a wrong answer? Do I have my own intuition to figure out how to fix that? And not everyone has an equal education learning what this is. How do we use it? Which I think is one perspective we haven't covered so much yet.
I think it's also worth noting that those of us in the Western world tend to assume that the quality of life we've got used to is the standard and the norm, and forget that we had to go through a journey to get there, and that actually the standard and the norm for human existence without innovation, without freedom, is poverty. Like, that's the baseline that we have to come up from. We don't, the life we live in the West isn't the automatic human quality of life that we should always expect for free.
Yeah, and one thing that I forgot to bring up is just the meaning of the term inequality, because it's given so many various meanings. and it's often just shorthand for inequality of income. But one of the things that the inequality of income led to was an equality of rights. And because the elites, in the Republic of Letters and the Enlightenment came up with these ideas of rights, and they were able to take their status as perhaps more educated and more wealthy and use it to create a system in which we all are equal in definitely the most important respect, which is that we are able, each of us, to go out into the world and to pursue our own happiness in whatever way we choose, so long as we don't violate the rights of others to do the same.
Yeah. So, yeah. So, trying to swing back again a bit more into an optimistic direction, you've all, pretty much everyone's mentioned AI in one form or another, so possibly aside from AI, but maybe including some of the secondary benefits of AI, what are some major discoveries or inventions that you're particularly excited about in the coming decades? That could be an invention, a development, or a scientific discovery in nature.
I think I've already mentioned mine, which is lab-grown meat, but it's something that has environmental, animal welfare, and I think also potentially cost of food implications as well. I mean, only a few years ago where a lab-grown burger cost, I think, $10,000, and it's getting closer towards $10 now. And if we're able to kind of industrialize production in that sphere, I think that could have some positive consequences just for people's cost of living. The amount of fields that would be saved with no longer having to farm cows and being able to use that to concrete over and build lots of new houses would be a huge benefit to that as well. And that's something that I think is fairly near term as well in terms of the actual commercialization process. There's inevitably, as with all things, plenty of government regulation that gets in the way of that commercialization process. The Good Food Institute does some good work spelling that out in more detail. And again, this is an area where the UK, having now left the EU, has the opportunity to try and do things differently. We're starting to kind of realise that we can take a different approach to these sort of things. And even though a lot of it's motivated by, I think, quite collectivist sentiment of the UK can become a world leader in this because flag waving is good, the net result of it is positive nonetheless.
Biotechnology has been mentioned before. I think that the whole field of medicine is in for a revolution with personalized medicine and being able to treat many forms of untreatable conditions. I'm also incredibly excited by mRNA technology, something that was there. Speaking of this whole sort of precautionary attitude, nobody liked mRNA. They didn't see the potential, and it was too risky. It took the crisis, it took the pandemic to get authorities away and just sort of, okay, let's do it, because the alternative is even worse. And once that has happened, it's possible to see how we could use it for an innumerable number of conditions, because what mRNA does is it basically makes our own body into a laboratory to produce the medicines we need, turn our genes into factories for health. And in that case, if we manage to crack the code, we should be able to come up with treatments for any kind of disease. So, I mean, in Britain and in all over Europe and the US right now, you can't get labs because there's so much excitement, so much money going into this, and clinical trials to use mRNA for cancer, and obviously any kind of virus but also cancer, rare genetic disorders, autoimmune diseases, and things like that. And I'm not sure we're going to be able to solve everything, but just the potential there is mind-blowing, I think.
Yeah, and I think part of that, at least tied into that, is the anti-aging technology and just the breakthroughs that have been made on that recently. So the thing that I'm most excited about is living forever. But I'm also really excited about lab-grown meat because I've had some, and some of the lab-grown meat, or the non-meat meat actually is really good. So I've come to actually prefer it in some cases to the real thing. Incredible.
Again, I already mentioned mine about the biological revolution. I was also going to add personalized medicine, so I'm very glad you brought it up. I think at the moment when all of our bodies are so extremely different, and all medicine is pretty much an average of every case, and therefore it fits no one. I'm looking forward to complete imaging of the human body, which doesn't irradiate you and damage you like X-rays currently do. And MRIs are so expensive that we can't all just afford an MRI scan because we want to know what our brain is doing. So cool bioimaging, something I hope to try out at some point in my career.
Just one more one, if I may, that's come to mind after all this discussion. Biotechnology is the development of artificial limbs. That's something that is already being trialled successfully to fairly short ages amongst animals. And again, there's various research restrictions on how long you can do that for. But once we get to that stage, from what I hear, I'm very glad that I personally will never be able to give birth. It can be, for many people, quite a horrible experience. The consequences of it can be very nice, of course, that's why people do it. But being able to kind of tackle some of the suffering, the significant suffering that can come from the process of childbirth, and also some of the knock-on effects relating to whether women go back into the workplace, for example, those sort of things I think can have really positive ramifications, and are at a stage where we can start thinking seriously about what that might look like in 10, 20, 30 years' time.
All of this and flying cars.
And flying
I'll quickly, firstly I'll second John's about beating aging, because I'm currently listening to Aubrey de Grey's book, Ending Aging, and he works with this group called the Sense Foundation to try and break through, and they've gone in 20 years from being laughed out of the room to serious breakthroughs in working with mice and extending their lifespans. So, and that will be a wonderful thing for human life. The one I'm most excited about, something John's written about, is Boom Supersonic. Blake Scholl trying to develop supersonic aircraft commercially, which I'll touch on in my talk on space as well. But yeah, as somebody who goes to America quite a lot, the ability to do it in 3 hours instead of 9 would be really very welcome. Now, we've got about 10 minutes left, I think. Yeah, so I'd like to.
Plus Q&A.
Plus Q. Oh, right. Okay. Well, I was going to throw it open now.
In that case, can I just add one thing where I would like to see innovation, but I'm not sure if anything is happening there. And that's another Star Trek thing, the food replicator. Wouldn't that be lovely? And theoretically you understand, it's atoms. You just have to find the right pattern and lots of cheap energy. And then we should be able to just press a button or talk to it and get an espresso or a perfect dry martini or lab-grown meat or whatever, replicated meat. Why doesn't that happen? That should be an area of research.
Or innovation, right? Press a button.
Yeah, exactly.
But I mean, because it is biology, these things, you can't model them with a simulation, like biological things. There's too much detail. You can model a physical system, maybe even a chemical system, but biology, like computationally, we wouldn't know how these things are structured to make and print them ourselves. We're trying, there's progress in there, but it's one of those things where I say just because it's easy to dream about doesn't mean it's easy to do, because as soon as you step into this system, you're talking about pressures and temperatures that you can't replicate in a lab because it's in the body or in the meat.
This is why you're the scientist. Just write books.
I think about this a lot.
Yeah, I do love with the Star Trek replicators that what they can and can't replicate depends entirely on what the plot needs to be scarce or not. But Star Trek Voyager going 7 years lost in deep space and just conveniently replicating everything they need except for the things that make for a good story. I just, before I go over to the audience, there was that audience question about the precautionary principle that Johan, you said you'd bring to the panel. I've unfortunately mostly forgotten what the question was. I don't know how well did anyone else remember exactly?
Risk mitigation and where the cost should be. Can we innovate our way out of risk mitigation?
Okay, so yeah, if anyone has any thoughts on that before we go to the audience, that would be welcome as well.
Was this an AI specific question or just like general precautionary principles? So I'll touch on this during my talk, so I won't preempt myself too much. But the problem that I see with people using the precautionary principle is it's not a substantially incorrect logical principle. It's a cost-benefit calculation, only seeing the cost. And often the benefits of innovation are either dispersed or unknown or unquantifiable in some sense. And so the natural focus is to go towards the cost side of what happens if things could go wrong. We don't know long-term implications of X or Y. And more time, I think, being able to try and spell out the benefits of particular innovation useful in terms of communicating when it comes to policymakers and whatnot. That's quite a vague answer, but I'm not sure if that answers your question.
I think the major problem, again, it can be interpreted in so many ways. So it's there is one reasonable version of it and many unreasonable versions of it. But the biggest problem is that every innovation comes with real problems and dangers and risks, and things will blow up. And people will die because of bicycles and cars, and there are so many risks and problems. And if we only look at that side and not the benefits, we've only made half a calculus of our cost-benefit analysis of things. And the thing is that life is dangerous. And it leads to death so far. So in that case, if we want to do something about the problems in the world, we have to innovate. And that will create other problems. And we can't just look at, if we want to deal with problems, we can't just look at problems. We have to look at what we're doing about it. And this is how the precautionary principle is distorted by others. Because I don't think, and by many authorities, and I don't think there's a way of innovating ourselves away from risk. That's part of human life, that's part of any kind of experiment. Because we are, by definition, trying to do something that we've never done before. And we won't know the results until we've done it for a very long time. So if we were to ban everything that could be abused, we first should ban the precautionary principle, because that leads to certain abuse.
Okay, just very quickly add to that, the standout example of the precautionary principle in recent years is lockdown and the reaction of governments to COVID. You talked about the innovation response to COVID, which was very impressive in more fields than just in vaccines. But I hate to think of the scale of lost potential economically and in human terms from all those years in different countries to different degrees of potential developments, potential inventions, potential growth of relationships, people meeting each other and that kind of stuff. All of that, plus all the growth of government as a result that we're now stuck with and the economic catastrophe we're facing now. I do worry a lot about how far that may have set back our society in many respects in the long run.
Yeah, I think it's perfectly reasonable to say to people, look, you should be careful. That makes perfect sense. And I don't think that anyone who's working on serious new technologies with potentially harmful ramifications, for the most part, are not being careful. Like most of these people, I think we should trust to be responsible with the technologies that they're creating. Not only because I think we ought to prioritize autonomy and give people the benefit of the doubt, but because they're in a better position to see both the risks and the benefits than anyone else. Of course, the bigger problem with innovation is that it creates problems that we don't foresee. But just as with the bicycle, it created the problem of not being able to stop, it also gave us the opportunity to figure out how to fix that problem. So I think that the cost of caution, it should be on the innovators. The innovators ought to, and usually do, like look at autonomous cars, kind of how much testing is going into creating autonomous vehicles, because they don't want the first headline to, inevitably it will come out. First headline will come out and say, autonomous car kills family or something like that. But if we look at what we gain from that, just the number of accidents that are caused by human error versus the everything, all the lives that we saved by removing that as a factor from the equation, far and away the benefits of innovation outweigh the cons, and we need to trust the innovators both to be looking at those things, but also to bear responsibility and bear the cost of creating safe innovations.
On a slight tangent, talking about maybe financial risk rather than risk mitigation, Johan mentioned today the concept of curiosity. and an open question that I'd like to approach is, how do we measure the profit value of curiosity? How can we fund endeavors that are seemingly meaningless? And I touched on this a little bit in our talk, but I think I almost want to bring it to the panel because I've not found an answer for this, and I think about it a lot, and I would love to pick people's brains if we're going into the Q&A part.
I can say something on that, which is that the pointless things will come out of the things that don't seem to be beneficial with the macro point of view. Like an example of this is asteroid mining. Like a lot of my friends who are interested in astronomy, like I am, will say if NASA hadn't run the space program, we wouldn't have had the Hubble Space Telescope and all the discoveries that it's brought, the James Webb Space Telescope now. And I'm thinking, if private companies had gone to mine asteroids, we could have put the telescopes on the asteroids, on their ships. We could have thousands of telescopes across the solar system. We could have a giant radio telescope from one side of the solar system to the other, taking images of things much further away than we can at the moment. So it's the less important, like Johan's sewing kitchen computer, or video gaming, and all of the benefits of computer technology that we've had from people trying to make Mario look better. Like it's just let the dumb stuff happen, and it will create so many unexpected opportunities for amazing, really meaningful advances in the longer run. Shall I throw it to the floor, or does anyone want to come back on what Rebecca said?
Yeah, I could say a quick thing on that. I think it's impossible to project the profit value of curiosity, except just to say that it's enormous. Because if you look at all the innovations that have ever happened, it's because somebody wasn't just in the field, pulling their corn. It's because they got curious about something, asked some questions, tinkered, and figured it out. So literally all of the wealth that we have is because of curiosity, and the smarter companies realize this. If you think of it, like there was a time when I think a lot more was spent in R&D by a lot more major companies, but even the smarter companies that we have today still spend a lot in just funding curiosity, like moonshot projects at Google. One of my favorite examples is Pixar, because this is part of their company culture. It's to cultivate creativity, and so they make room for fun. They make room for messing up and making mistakes, because often those mistakes lead to really cool things that nobody could have foreseen.
One last thing I'll say on curiosity is we've got to stop drilling it out of our children as well. Like the school environment, I went through this. So you like aeroplanes, you're gay. Like the attitude at school is appalling for somebody who's interested in the world around them, and we need to change our society to encourage that curiosity and not belittle it. All right. Does anyone in the audience have any? Yep.
Okay. So just like basically my question is, what do you think? Like you mentioned, like who's the countries that's gonna innovate the most, and like the biggest innovations that we used to have and even have now, like in Ukraine, is out of necessity. It's because of fear. Like especially the military one, high tech to some point, it developed out of necessity and fear. And like you mentioned, Israel, like it's probably the leaders with the states, like in innovation in military, because they have to. Like there's no point when your situation is like life or death, you will innovate because you have to. And like Elon Musk, for example, with this like incredible like innovation of SpaceX, like sending a successful rocket that doesn't blow up on return and lands, like it's really hard. And he managed to do it like quite fast with a lot of money, but he still managed to do it so fast. And he also said it because he does it out of fear. He really thinks that our situation here, when we are limited just to Earth, is not good. So we need to go out to explore other planets and make a living there. So he does it out of actual fear, and it like takes a lot of mental toll on him also, because if you do something out of fear, it stresses you out a lot. So, but still it generates like the largest amount of innovation and the best innovations. and it has actually the potential to change everything. So, like also with this company, like with OpenAI that he co-founded, and with all the rise of like AI and especially machine learning, like for example also in machine learning in science, like the new modern combinations of computational physics, chemistry, and biology could develop at such a high rate that maybe in 10 years our leading scientists won't understand what the machine learning is doing, but it could still solve problems that we have ever had, and it could work. So, like he said, the biggest problem is that regulation of the law just won't keep up with it. So, like role players who just use the same technology to create, like for example, with nuclear power and nuclear bombs, and like especially even grid. Like if someone could like kill the whole grid of Europe, a lot of people will die, like, because power is so important in our day that you need it for heating. Like not you, but you need it to heat it. You need it for eating. You need it for food. You need it for everything. So if a role player could use the new technology of AI or machine learning to actually like create something bad because of the regulations in the countries that develop them, like now it's the States and Europe, if they don't keep up on regulations fast, it could get to the point where AI isn't in the control of the countries that created it. So what's your thought about that?
Anyone? I think the general gist of the question was, is fear a good motivator, and do we need to be concerned about people hijacking innovations?
I mean, for me, fear exists on all innovation, as I see it, is problem solving, right? And fear is an extreme problem that really needs to be solved right now. So I don't see fear as kind of a separate motivator. I mean, I think it's a very important one in the cases that you cite, obviously, Ukraine and Israel. On I think kind of AI safety stuff more broadly, I think there's a really interesting argument, and I think quite a valid one, that if you're sitting in the US or the UK and you're worried about geopolitical pressures from machine learning development and AI development in other countries, then that's a really powerful incentive for you to deregulate machine learning development in order to keep up in the kind of global race. It's not an argument that I thought of before, but one that, yeah, it's super interesting, and I'll think more about. Yeah, don't really have any answers, but thank you for raising that. Food for thought.
Perhaps slightly another tangent, but as we've said, technology and innovation can be used in bad ways by bad people as well. And it's not always a good thing that people become more powerful, because they can also destroy on a larger scale. And that's precisely why I'm in favor of open systems for innovation. Because the more open it is, the more we reduce the risk that it'll only be in the hands of a few people who'll use it. And the good thing of broad, open societies where everybody can innovate is that there are more people who do not want to destroy the world than who want to destroy the world. Which means that even though there will be people who want to hijack the technology and use it in nasty ways, there will be more people thinking hard about how to avoid that. Some people will try to make bombs to blow us up, and then millions of others will experiment with sort of intelligent dust that will sense the material used in those bombs to reduce those risks. So, I mean, opening up the possibility for the fact that there are more good people than bad people out there, I think is an incredibly important insight.
Yeah, I think, well, if you look at fear as a motivator with regard to COVID, which came up a minute ago, it created a spotlight on the world's biggest problem and said, we have to solve this problem. But it certainly did not replace the curiosity of the scientists who came together to create the solution. And I think this is always the case. It's that fear can turn our attention to some really important problem, as Daniel mentioned, but it's really not in itself the creative problem solver. It's just the alert, the red alert saying, pay attention to this. But in terms of what actually drives innovation. It's not the fear itself, it's what we answer that fear with. And that is the curiosity, I think, that Rebecca mentioned.
Another example of fear that I don't think we've brought up yet is absolutely the climate alarmism and fear of the environment and climate change. And a lot of people's response to that fear is to march outside the government and say, do something, rather than thinking, what part of this problem do I want to tackle and how should I tackle it? That's my thoughts on it.
Any other? Do you know? Oh, Eli, then do you know?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Just
So
about.
you've all discussed how you want to keep government outside of the economy, and Johan, in your talk you spoke about how innovation happens organically and through open societies, and you want to keep government out of that. And Daniel, I think one of the first things you said is keep government outside of the economy. So I want to pick on a slightly more technical aspect of that, and I'd like to hear your thoughts about government granting monopolies to inventors in the form of patents and intellectual property rights, whether you think that's a justified means of government intervention in the economy, and how do you relate that to innovation?
The IP question has always been an interesting one for me. It's something I actually changed my mind on over the course of a number of years, and I started out being pretty aggressively anti all forms of intellectual property, and through a couple of colleagues at the ASI who at the Adam Smith Institute who looked at this topic in more detail, and we discussed the kind of the trade-offs that you get where you might, with IP, you might have more initial innovation and less follow-on innovation because it's harder to build upon certain new inventions when you have to go through the patent process, etc. I'm now broadly pro-IP in that I think that it, in general, it encourages more innovation than it holds back. The question for me is purely, if I was convinced that it held back innovation, then I would oppose it. I think the case for it is strongest in areas like the pharma sector. I think it's probably weakest when it comes to things like copyrights or the more kind of creative industries. I'm less convinced of a need for IP there. But yeah, for me, it's purely a kind of very, very difficult economics question, as opposed to one necessarily of rights for their own sake. But I'm sure others on the panel will have different perspectives on that particular discussion.
Yeah, I think there's a moral case to be made that just like John Locke pointed out that if we mix our labor with something that's nobody's, we thereby need a protection for our life project. And that could be a field, it could be a manufacturing process, but I think it could also be ideas. We're mixing our ideas with and coming up with a combination that didn't exist before. And I think there's some moral case to be made that that's mine. And I think, but it's also a very interesting economic problem, and it can be abused in many ways. And I think we've seen that in certain forms of patent applications where it's not really a new discovery or innovation, but basically just looking at what others have already been doing and laying claim to it. But that's obviously an abuse of something that I think is there is a moral case for. But economically, I think the important insight is that we talk about patents as if and intellectual property rights as if that was a way of making it exclusive. I think it's the opposite. It's actually our way of being able to reveal our new insights and our new innovations and show it to the rest of the world, because we're safe in the understanding that if they're going to use it, they're going to have to license it and pay me and so on and so on. So I think if we didn't have it, we'd keep our innovations more secret and more exclusive than we do now.
On the topic of patenting ideas, it was a few months ago I had an idea, I started Googling, and the only time I found some results, and one result was a lady on a forum who said, yes, we can do this idea, I've written this down, this is on the internet now you can't patent it. I was like, that's a little bit naive, because yeah, you have this idea, but you haven't said anything about how you're going to dare approach this topic. This requires a lot of technological development, so I would be cautious for people to say, okay, idea, stake it, this is mine now, but not actually do any problem solving, just be like, yeah, I'll put that out somewhere, it's mine.
Yeah, I would agree with Johan that there is a moral case for intellectual property rights, because when you invest your time into creating some innovation, you're investing your life. And if you own your life, then I think you own the product of your life and your time, which is the thing that you've created. I don't know about the particulars about how many years we ought to be able to have claim to this thing exclusively. I think that that's an area perhaps where we want to have more experimentation and to compare different systems to others and ask which works best and why. But just at the moral level, I do think that people ought to have some ability to profit from the things that they create, because it was their life that they invested into it.
We've got about 2 minutes, so I'd like to hear Juno's question if she still wants to.
Yeah.
Probably have like time for one answer, I expect.
Right. So I don't know if I'm doing a panel justice here, but so throughout most of the discussion, everyone kind of discusses the benefit of from innovation as kind of in a collectivist way of benefit for or by humanity. But in fact, like there are so many new individual rights issues that arises that literally have we literally have to create new rights. For example, like what information are you obliged to disclose on food packaging? Like, do I own 100 meters above my roof? And sort of questions like that. So, who decides? So who has what right? Like, who decides who has what right to claim what and who is responsible? And yeah, so like, who determines these laws or rules regarding rights, and how can it be done?
Who's going to jump on that in the time remaining?
Yeah, that's an interesting gray zone in those areas. I think it's difficult to give one precise answer there. Or does anyone?
Well, I think that thinkers, and particularly philosophers, at least historically, have been the ones who have sort of used both their experience of the world and their reasoning and logic to come up with the sort of parameters for what is fair and what is unfair. So I think that basically, if we look at reality itself, as in the case of intellectual property rights, for instance, we see that there was a person who used his time and his life to create this product, and he ought to, just as he owns his life, he ought to use the product of his time. And so I think that ultimately reality tells us these things, but it does take somebody who can discern what reality is telling us and comprehensively convey that.
Okay, I think we're pretty much at time now, but I want to say a massive thank you to our panelists, and yes.